Guru Nation, thank you so much for watching. Make sure you like, subscribe, comment, share in that order, if possible. At least one of those four things. All right. Very bare bones, no nonsense, practical video for the site owners or site directors. Preferably the smaller the better. This was inspired by a text I got this morning. By the way, you guys didn't know you can do this. You can text me. It's 949-415-6256. I got asked a question today. Good morning, Dan. As a site owner, do you do all the continuing review reports like for the IRB and stuff? Or once you hit SIV and after your coordinators take over all regulatory? No. So the coordinators do it all. I supervise and I had to train them. It didn't just happen overnight. Like, yes, when I first started, before we hired anyone else, it was me doing everything, every aspect of the site. We didn't even have a staff. The very first staff member we actually hired was a remote hire named Samantha Anderson. Shout out to the CRC Academy. She was doing everything via Creo, data entry, primarily data entry, and then helping out with like regulatory, like where to file things in Creo and answering some queries. That was really it. But even before we hired her, I was doing it all. And I already have experience. Like, I think there's value in doing it for yourself. Number one, if you've never done research, like you have almost no choice. You need to learn this stuff. But even if you have, like, even if this is like not your first site, you need to understand the lay of the land in a place like Yuma, in a place like wherever you are. You need to have a fundamental understanding of the nuances of like every market's different, right? Every PI is different. So I created a system and I tweaked my SOPs to fit the system. And then we started hiring after Samantha Anderson, who was our first employee. We hired 2 people on the ground, 2 full-time coordinators who were not trained as coordinators. All right. And one of them still here to this day. Shout out to Katie. She just had her 2-year anniversary yesterday. I trained them. Like everything that I did, I tried to instill into them. And I had every incentive to do so because as a site owner, you don't want to work in your business. You want to work on your business, meaning growing it, maintaining it, building it, improving it. Working in your business, meaning doing a screening visit, doing a randomization visit, doing an early term, reminding a patient to come in, scheduling a patient, doing IRB continuing reviews. That's working in your business. That's not growing your business. That is maintaining what you've already built. I think every site owner, site director, once they learn the fundamentals and they've built a system, should work on the business. Now, part of working on the business is maintaining quality control systems. So however you call it at your site, I don't care. I know people are going to argue, well, what you're actually talking about is QC, QA. I don't care what it is. I use those terms interchangeably because at my site, there is no difference, right? I know at some bigger sites, academic centers, it's like, well, this is QC department, this is QA department. Call it whatever you want. Call it managing quality at your site, having a complete quality management system. I'm doing that. I'm trying to remove myself from this too. But the people we've had have graduated to go do other jobs. They were our CRA Academy interns. So I'm kind of like in between promoting someone to do this. Honestly, I think it's going to be Katie that's ultimately like she's the lead CRC. I think to have her do lead CRC/QA would be a smart thing to do. But this video is all about QA, QC, whatever you call it. You got to have a training system first in order to be able to remove yourself from the day-to-day and to just have an eye on quality. So what do I mean by that, and how do you do that like in a no-nonsense approach? It starts with patient safety. So patient safety should be where no corners are cut. And patient safety also includes informed consent. And a lot of the issues, and one of the biggest FDA findings during audits, are informed consent issues. And those are considered patient safety issues. So things like, is the process of consent being followed? Do you have a process of consent? Are you following your SOPs? Are you documenting everything? Did the PI sign where they needed to sign on the consent? Did the patient sign where they needed to sign? Did they miss a signature? Did the staff member miss a signature? These are quality assurance tasks for the informed consent. The next thing you need is labs, all right? Is every out of range lab value getting initialed by the PI or an appropriate designee for CS or NCS, clinical significance or not clinical significance, and in a timely manner, in a contemporaneous manner, meaning if you screen someone, are they getting reviewed before you randomize that person? Or if you had one study visit, are they getting reviewed before that patient's next study visit? Like, that's the bare minimum threshold. If it's longer than what I just mentioned, if the labs are not getting signed or assessed until after the next visit, that's bad. That's a finding. So as long as they're getting assessed, obviously the more quickly they're getting looked at, the better. But at least have minimum thresholds, like at least before the next visit. We try to do it again, day of that we get them, maybe the next day by the PI or a sub-I. So this is part of quality assurance, quality control, whatever you call it as well. We call it quality assurance. Labs, ECGs, same thing. Are those getting looked at by the PI or an appropriate designee? Inclusion, exclusion criteria, huge thing. You should have built-in checklists for QA. If you have eSource, you can do this in Creo. You can have a QA check sheet for all these things I mentioned. Did somebody look at the informed consent? Did somebody look at making sure the PI or an appropriate designee signed off on the labs, ECGs, inclusion, exclusion criteria? You can actually have more than one person have to sign off on it within Creo to double check. And if you're finding that people are just clicking boxes and not actually doing anything, you should fix that system. Like, no matter how well you think you've made your system for QA, things can always fall through the cracks, but you can put enough redundancies in place to where you minimize these risks and you minimize the occurrence of quality assurance being ignored. So, informed consent, again, you can have the process of consent written down and documented, or you can have a checklist embedded within the source that forces you to do that. And on top of that, you can have one other staff member sign off that it was done. So now you have at least two people looking at important things like informed consents, labs, ECGs, inclusion, exclusion criteria. Inclusion, exclusion criteria needs to be thoroughly looked at. There are things, especially when you get medical history involved and the way it works at a research site, you don't always have access to the patient's medical records at the day of screening. Sometimes you get the medical records like maybe a day before you randomize the patient. Well, it's very easy to make mistakes like, oh, no history of cancer, but on page 44 of these 88 pages of medical history that you just received today, it says back in 2017, patient had skin cancer. Well, somebody needs to be checking these things. And it sounds simple when you say inclusion, exclusion criteria must be met. But when you look at just a random study of yours and you look at inclusion, exclusion criteria, it's not uncommon to see something like 21 inclusion criteria and 50 exclusion criteria. Each one of those sometimes can be complex. Like some of the inclusion exclusion criteria are like paragraphs long. Like number 7, exclusion criteria number 7, just hypothetical, might be several sentences and say something like, well, if this or that and or, like it's written in such a way that there's a lot of ambiguity involved, and there's a lot of like interpretation. And just to be on the safe side, you might want to run it by your CRA or your medical monitor. And if you're randomizing the patient the next day because they're going to be out of window, you need to get on it. So the QA needs to be constantly working. The QA needs to be integrated within your process. And the only way to do that is to separate that from the actual coordinator, or to have like a primary coordinator for one study and a backup for the same study. And then they reverse roles on the next study. And then one person is the primary coordinator, the other one's the backup / QA. And then on the other study, they're reversed. The roles are reversed. Or you can do like we do at our site. There's not really a primary coordinator. It's really our lead CRC, Katie, who's the primary coordinator on everything. But then we need a QA system. And for the time being, that's me, because it just was a couple of individuals who just got hired somewhere else. So now it's back to being me, but I'm about to have Katie start doing this as well. And I'm about to start having the coordinators kind of alternate at least week by week. Okay, who's doing QA this week? Who's doing QA next week? There's different ways you can do this. Just find something that makes sense for your site and works for your site. And if it doesn't work, change it. That's one of the advantages of being a small site. You'll know if it works or doesn't work right away. If it doesn't work right away, you don't need to wait for the next board meeting to change something like they have to do at academic medical centers. This is why nothing gets done in a timely manner there. At an AMC, if something's not working, they've got to wait months, sometimes years, to change a process. At a small site, you can do it right away. This is what I love about being a small site owner, small business owner. A lot of the places where people would perceive as weakness, hey, you're small, you don't have resources a bigger company might have. You actually have strength. Those could be your strengths too. Well, I don't have to wait for approval. I don't have red tape all around my site to where I can't do anything. I don't need to ask approval from anyone. I just do it. These are common sense quality assurance initiatives you need to put into your site. So that's patient safety stuff. The next there's one more patient safety thing, and that's IP compliance. Before we move on to the next things, IP compliance, investigational product compliance, investigational product accountability. Somebody needs to look at this stuff constantly, and I don't care who it is. If it's your backup coordinator, if it's your lead CRC, if you have a site director, if you have a separate quality assurance person, or a combination of all of the above, you just have to have it in place. And you can change it if it doesn't work. That's fine. So investigation of product accountability and investigation of product compliance, and that includes temperature excursions. So there's no way with today's technology and trackers and 24/7, 365 continuous temperature monitoring device. We use TempStick at our site. You can set text alerts, email alerts for plus or minus or above the temperature threshold, below the temperature threshold, who gets notified. You can build in redundancy with these technology systems. But someone should be looking at those things, because when you get alerts for all kinds of things, as you will start getting alerts for everything when you start doing a study, it's very easy to ignore alerts just because you see them all the time. Like, we get out of window alerts almost every day from one of our studies just because of the way the study's designed. It's very easy to ignore any alerts from that vendor just because you're getting out of window alerts 90% of the time. 10% of the time, it might be an alert like a lab alert. But then because you're used to seeing, you're associating alert, or the coordinator is associating alert with out of window for that study, that when they see a lab alert, their brain kind of just, they don't even process it. They're in autopilot and they say, okay, that's out of window alert. And then the monitor comes later and says, hey, that was a lab alert. How come nobody noticed? Well, that's because you don't have a quality assurance system in place, meaning a human being who is responsible for looking at that stuff and not ignoring it, and usually should not be the primary coordinator of that study. Or it should be a shared responsibility, meaning this week you're doing it, next week you're doing it, or again, you have one QA person in charge of doing it, or you hire a contractor. I mean, there's so many different ways you can go about it. I don't care how you do it. I don't know which one works better. Again, everything for everyone else. But the majority of sites don't even have, well, I won't say the majority, but many small sites don't even have any system in place for quality. And that's really risky in my opinion. So, investigation of product accountability, which includes temperature excursions, but it also includes things like, did the patient take the IP as instructed? Well, how do we know? Did you actually count the pills? No. Did the coordinator do it? Okay, I'm assuming the coordinator did, but now how do you know that what they counted was actually correct? Did you actually count? Or did somebody else besides that coordinator count to make sure? We know the PI is not doing it. Most of the times the monitor is not even doing it until closeout visits. So someone else at the site needs to do it. These are the things where you don't want these kind of important issues to fall through the cracks, because these are FDA findings. These are things that will get your site shut down from sponsors. These are things that will get sponsors to take studies away from you and not give you future work. So you need to take care of this kind of stuff. Now we can move on to regulatory, which is kind of what inspired this video today, was the text I got. Regulatory compliance. Who's actually checking that your site's following your SOPs? Like every site has SOPs. So are you guys constantly in every study visit and whenever it's applicable, every regulatory interaction or every activity done at the site, are you compliant 100% with your SOPs? And how do you know? And what happens when you don't? What happens when you inadvertently are not compliant with your SOPs versus when you advertently are incompliant because of another reason? And then is it documented, and how is it documented, and how are people retrained, and where is that documented? This is quality assurance too. And if you keep not being compliant with a certain aspect of your SOP, why not change it to where you can be compliant? Because another one of the biggest findings of FDA audits is sites not being compliant with their own SOPs. But who's doing this? You can't just put all of this on your coordinator when they're just trying to tread water and make it through the day without drowning just because of all the work they have. This is the site director, site owner, ultimately the PI, but hopefully before it gets to that point, somebody else, QA, quality assurance. This is what I'm talking about in this video. Same thing with the IRB expirations. Like here we have a board on the wall. We have all of our studies with the different IRB expirations for the site approval. Like every year, your site approval will expire. A month or two before that, somebody should fill out the new application that's called a continuing review report. Who's checking to make sure your IRB approval is not expired? Yeah, it's supposed to be your CRA, but what happens when they don't do their job? Do you think the FDA is going to say, okay, well, the CRA didn't do their job, so it's not your fault, PI? No. It's your responsibility as the PI. You signed the back of that 1572. And then if you're the site owner, it's your responsibility. And if you don't have a QA system in place yet, guess what? You need to be the one doing it until you figure out something that works. So, IRB expirations for the site, continuing approval, informed consent, current versions. Do you know how many times I've monitored where I've seen multiple major deviations of patients signing the old versions of the informed consent and not the new one. As soon as an informed consent is approved by the IRB, the latest version, at the next visit, the next patient visit, they should have a new informed consent process documented and that informed consent signed. If you miss one, that's a major deviation. Again, who's checking all this stuff? Another one is IATA expirations, GCP expirations, medical license expirations, CLIA waiver or CLIA expirations. These are things that are quality assurance, and Creo makes it easy in the E-Reg, and I know Viva does too, where you can put alerts when this particular certificate expires for this person and when this CLIA expires, and equipment calibration. You want to do a study with an expired calibration? If your SOP says every year our equipment get calibrated, and you're doing a study and it's been longer than a year since your equipment's been calibrated, you're in violation of your SOPs. Technically, that data that you collect is not valid. These are big findings. You can't just put this all on the coordinator. This is quality assurance. You have to have a separate system, a separate process, a separate department. Even if it was all on the coordinator's responsibility, which it's not, but even if you could argue that it is, it's not humanly possible when you're that busy to keep track of all these things. Even with redundancy like built in, like Creo will remind you via email alerts. Viva will remind you. Coordinators are human beings. They get 1,000 emails a day, some of them. Like, yeah, they might ignore or miss an email. You're still in violation, so you need a QA department for that. So there's a lot of things, and this is just source and regulatory, and it's not even all the source. It's just the patient safety facing side of the source. If you want to go further into the source, like are you being compliant with every aspect of your SOP? Well, a lot of your SOPs are not patient safety stuff. It's just regular operations stuff. PI oversight's another big thing. Right, so these are things, quality assurance, that I see a lot of sites not cutting corners, but they're just assuming, especially the smaller sites, oh, the CRAs, that's their job, or it's the CRC's job. No, those people are human beings. They're overworked. They're busy. You need QA at your site, and if you don't have a system in place, that's you. I hate to break it to you, but that's you, and that's currently the situation with me. I had a break from it for a while, but now it's back in my shoes, and I'm training our lead CRC on how to do that. And I think we're going to work some things out where all the coordinators are going to take turns every week being the QA person. I think that's probably the best way to go about it. Guru Nation, there's so much more with this stuff, but I just want, if nothing else from this video, you need to pay attention to details, and you can't just depend on a coordinator to do it. You need a system in place. And if you need to tweak your system, you need to revise your SOPs. It's all quality assurance. Like, subscribe, comment, share, Guru Nation. Let me know what you think. Let me know what I missed. Bye-bye. Hey, if you guys like that kind of content, make sure you like, subscribe, comment, share. Stay tuned for more videos.